Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's online film discussion of The Remains of the Day. I'm Jacob Mazer. I'm the Special Programming Manager at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I will be the moderator this evening. We're very happy that you're joining us. Hope you're all well. Before we dive into our discussion, I'd like to take just a few moments to go through our procedures. So please do keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question or making a comment. If you do have a question to ask or a comment to make, please use that raise hand function within Zoom, and you can see what that looks like on the diagram on screen. And I will call on you when it's your turn. Please unmute yourself at that point and mute yourself when you're finished. We're going to be using the chat window as well, and you can see that icon also on the slide. If you would prefer to share your thoughts or even raise a question that way, that's fair game, and we'll do our best to bring that into the discussion. Lastly, let me say that if you are joining us for the first time, I do hope you'll use the chat function to introduce yourself. And if you're outside the area, please let us know where you're located. So with that said, I think we're ready to get down to business and begin our discussion of The Remains of the Day. And I'm going to look for hands to ask a question. I see the quick draw Glussmans right up. So please unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, even if you can't see us tonight. We've certainly enjoyed the times together. We enjoyed this movie, and at some level, I found myself intrigued by the back and forth. And one of the things I'll ask you to comment on is the editing. The cinematography, I thought, was really good. We got a really good feel for this time in Great Britain and the type of home and grounds, etc. I understood a lot about the back and forth and the why. There were a couple of places where the cuts seemed not to be as well defined and as well described as others. And, you've got the background for editing, and give us a little bit of your thoughts there. And I'm always intrigued when I see really good acting and actors working together so well. If you know any of the background, I looked quickly and didn't see anything on how the casting came about. I thought this was an interesting pairing and casting, but you may have some other background. The Remains of the Day was fun to watch, interesting. Certainly glad that you chose it for us. And as I said at the beginning, it's good to see you, even if you can't see us tonight.
Well, thanks, David. Let me just ask you a clarifying question. So when you say the back and forth, can you be a little bit more specific about what you're referring to?
Sure. There were a couple of scenes that I unfortunately, I didn't write down exactly which ones. Most of the scenes going back and forth in the time frames were fairly clear. There were a couple where I felt less clear, like, it took me 10 or 15 seconds into a cut to be sure whether it was just a change in the scene or a change back and forth in the time. Most of those were more in the middle of the film as opposed to the beginning or toward the end. And while I'm back on, you can comment to the extent you feel appropriate with the way the book has sort of put the characters at the end with this, I'm going to call it, this totally unrequited love, both directions. I didn't read the book. Janice did. The book and the movie, I'm told, are in many ways differently told. But I kept waiting and almost expecting by the end for there to have been a very different ending. But again, maybe that's food for thought for you. You have to decide that. But thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks, David, and thanks for that clarifying point. So, the question about the cutting, I kind of think where I want to take that is with regards to the way the film treats time. Because as you say, we do sort of shift in between these separate time frames. We have a frame story and we, make stops in the past. The characters in this film, Stevens especially, among others, I think have an interesting and complicated relationship to the past. And I think some of the sort of porous boundaries between the different, time frames speak to that a little bit. So let me say a little bit more about that. There's a couple ways where I think time is a little bit confused or a little bit complicated here. One is with the sense of nostalgia. At the beginning of the film, we hear, I believe in a letter, we hear, I don't recall if it's Stevens or if it's Miss Kenton, but we hear a reference to the sort of days, the glory days of Lord Darlington and the time frame in which much of the action unfolds. It's referred to as the good old days, which is curious because in many ways it's a difficult time. And so too do we see in the in the sort of among the aristocratic coterie of the house. We see these high society members who seem to be trying to cling on and sort of cement a certain version of English society that, whose time is starting to fall away. So there are these various characters who are looking back to the past and a little bit wedded to the past. We see this too in the way that Stevens moves through the house. Recall at the very beginning that we see a shot of some extended staff, some under butlers or some other servants sort of waiting on Stevens or sort of supporting him outside the house, and they sort of evaporate. We see this effect a couple times. So I think, we can continue to develop this and explore this over the course of our conversation. But I do think one thing that we should be attentive to is the ways that characters are looking back to the past, still living in the past, imagining a past, even a version of the past that isn't quite what happened, and trying to go back to the past and reconstruct the past. So we can perhaps talk more about that, but I'm going to leave that question here. And I see a hand from Kathleen McCarroll. So Kathleen, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Jacob, thank you so much for choosing this film. I enjoyed it so much. I saw it in 1993 when it first came out, and I enjoyed it then. And I read the book both then and now for this discussion. And I found the book and the movie to be very parallel. I thought they both each followed the movie followed the book very closely, I thought, close enough to my style. So I thought that was good. I wanted to talk a little bit about something you brought up in your introductory talk, which was the house as a character, which we've talked about before, I think, for some other movies. And while the house was impressive, to say the least, I didn't find it to be so much a character in this film. Although Stevens does talk about it, he says, "You have given good service to the house. The house appreciates this service." But I don't know. I was thinking about what could be different that would give it more character. And the first thing I thought of was, well, there's no impressive staircase in the beginning, as there was for example, in the Magnificent Ambersons. Right. So the staircase they use is not shown in a way that invokes that sense of majesty about a staircase. And they also don't give different shots of sometimes you'll see shots of like a gallery looking down into a hall, and that enhance the vastness of the house. They didn't have that kind of thing. And there was a part in the book where Miss Kenton said very specifically, one of the things that she loved so much about the house were the views from the upper windows into the moors. And they didn't show anything like that in the movie. And I miss those kind of things for something that I was looking to see a bigger presence of the house. I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Certainly. Kathleen, thank you for bringing that to the table, and thanks for sharing your reflections. As you say, I mean, this sort of trope of the house as a presence, maybe even as a character, is certainly one that we see in lots of other films. Some perhaps in the same lane as The Remains of the Day, and some very different. So I'd like, if I could, to suggest perhaps 3 ways that we could think about the house as a presence here, or where the house may play more of a role than just being, I don't know, a setting or a backdrop. So the first is, I'm always intrigued and impressed and interested by the sort of system of secret passages that run through the house. And, you know, there's this sort of stark contrast. This is part of the upstairs downstairs dynamic that that the film has, and that I talked about in the introduction a little bit. We have, of course, this opulent, you know, lavish public space in the house. And then behind the scenes, there's a fairly drab, fairly utilitarian section of the house that is kept from public view, in many cases hidden behind disguised doors, where, you know, where the service staff works and lives and moves through. And this, I think, is interesting because in a number of ways, this theme of secret areas or secret passages or secret thoughts or secret feelings, you know, this sense of a part of a whole that isn't expressed outwardly, is something that we see, I think, both in the psychological depiction of the characters, Stevens, of course, among others. And I think there may be a political valence to that as well. A second, I think, interesting way that the house comes to play in the film is that we see there's a sort of motif kind of scene that we see recur, you know, over the course of the film. Early on, Stevens says, the world used to come to Darlington Hall. And we see these various scenes of the world, you know, as it were, coming to Darlington Hall, these scenes of people arriving at the manor. At the very beginning of the film, of course, you know, which is far in the future of most of the events, we see the house being dismantled and the pieces being put up to auction. Then we flash back and we see this, this fox hunt going on. And over the course of the film, you know, we see these various scenes of people showing up at the house, and the tenor changes. We see people arriving for the conference. Later, we see, you know, the character who's a stand-in for the British fascist Sir Oswald Mosley showing up, and he has black shirts with him. He has, you know, what are basically a militia. Most strikingly, we have this sort of scene of the midnight meeting, where there seems to be negotiations over basically a policy of appeasement. And we see the prime minister as well as actual Nazis at the house. And they arrive in the dead of night. You know, the house is dark at that point. And I think the sort of way that this sort of recurring theme and this recurring sort of staging, you know, comes back and changes, sort of speaks to the way that the house is changing and the way the mood is changing and the way things are going. And I think the cinematography gives us some clues as well. This will be the last bit I'll say about this, but, you know, it's worth going back to look at that scene of the midnight meeting. Perhaps you recall the scene I'm talking about. This is where, like I said, these actual Nazis arrive in the middle of the night to formulate, you know, this policy of appeasement that's going to open the way for Hitler to continue to expand and to invade Czechoslovakia. And we see the house, we see them move through a room that's very dark and the walls are blood red. You know, it's and it's a sort of striking kind of ghastly effect that for me is, you know, a little alarming to see in this space, which, you know, which we've come to feel comfortable in. And we also see, I think there's some interesting shots where we see these very wide shots of these, grand, gorgeous chambers, but we see the characters in them and they're just about this big. There's a sense where these people are becoming isolated or they're becoming dwarfed, both dwarfed by the march of events, as it were. It's become too big for them and they're very small. And, there's also an alienation of the characters from each other. This is that sequence unfolds as Stevens and Miss Kenton are having their schism. So, those are some of the ways that I was thinking about. I certainly am interested to hear others. So I'll leave that one there. I see we have another hand from the Glusmans, and I will go there in a moment. Is there anybody who hasn't made a comment yet who has a reflection or a thought to share or a question to raise? Well, we're going to kick it back to the Glusmans in the meantime.
Well,
and I'm going to start asking you guys questions.
I appreciate that. I had another thought that, the whole crux, and you started to talk about it. We've seen in the last 2 years a couple of movies that focus on the appeasement from slightly different angles, and a lot of the books that I've enjoyed over the last couple decades have talked about the enigma and some of the crypto, the encryption issues that related there. And I was wondering whether you knew any of the background on sort of how the writer but how he portrayed this particular aspect. The House of Darlington is really almost a center pre-World War II of the appeasement, and almost actively so. And that that long table, big meeting discussion where Reeves' character is really the only one to, I guess, to speak what we now know to have been the truth about what the options and opportunities really were not at the time. And if you knew anything about the sort of the writer's background on coming at this from that aspect, so much of this is the story of Stevens in his mind, but he's got this very hard background of what's occurred in that part of his past that he, at some level, has to deal with. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Sure.
So I'll qualify this by saying I have to admit I haven't read the novel, and I can't speak too much to the novelist Ishiguro's perspective. I will say that the film kind of interestingly mixes up, takes elements from real life and fictionalizes some things, I think, to spruce up the narrative as well. So, we do know that there was a group of British aristocrats similar to the ones that we see in the movie who were sympathetic to Germany, and who advocated and helped, for a time realize a sort of policy of appeasement with Hitler. And we see a couple of these figures show up in the film, sometimes in fictionalized forms. So, for example, there's the fellow who shows up with the black shirts is in the film. He's named Lord Wren, but he's a counterpart for a real former member of parliament named Oswald Mosley, who founded the British Union of Fascists. And, if you look up, if you Google Sir Oswald Mosley, you'll see that he looks, they've clearly made the actor up to look like him. The black shirts that we see with him are, modeled after the historical black shirts. And you can see, all sorts of images of these guys going around and, doing the fascist salute and all that. We also see, a figure named Lord Halifax show up. He's actually given his name, and a character who is referred to only as the Prime Minister, who's clearly Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. But there are fictionalized aspects too. Lord Darlington is a creation. And, the last thing I want to mention is that there's, during that scene of the grand banquet where, we have these kind of passive aggressive toasts, and Christopher Reeve character Lewis sort of makes his plea to them. There's an interesting film reference here, a kind of fun one, which is that he refers to them as amateurs. And if you've seen the Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Foreign Correspondent, there is a sort of similar scene where an American, albeit a sort of less clued in one, kind of dresses down a group of high-minded, but sort of airheaded British fellows by referring to them as amateurs. So it's a sort of, I think, fun nod in that direction. I have a question I want to raise with the group, which is, how do you see the relationship between these two threads of the narrative? The two sort of big pieces of this story, perhaps, are the sort of domestic dimension, which follows first Stevens and his father, and more prominently, the relationship of Stevens and Miss Kenton, which, as was noted before, is a kind of double-sided, unrequited love story. And then on the other hand, there's this political dimension, where we see Stevens sort of embedded in the midst of this political movement that turns out to be bad. So the question I wanted to ask to you is, do you see a relationship between these two things? How did they thread together or not thread together for you?
I'm not sure whether we're having a two-way dialogue here. I don't know if you recall, or you would have known, I think that, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, one of our movies was Munich, The Edge of War. And in its way, it put together this the same appeasement issue, and then, of course, later on into the actual early time of the war with the love story. And I think that, perhaps I'm oversimplifying, but in so many of these books and movies that we end up enjoying, the writer, author, director helps sort of avoid an overload on one item. You could overload on just Stevens and the relationship, and that might get more boring if you did that. But here you intersperse the issues of the pre-war, the politics as you describe it, the interpersonals. You bring in the godson with a little bit of a slightly different interpersonal relief there. And so when you ask about the juxtaposition, I look at that as a combination of multiple storylines. And in some respects, if a story for 2 hours or thereabouts is too intense on just one subject, you don't get that little bit of relief for your brain to absorb and go into the other story for a little bit. So that's maybe simplistic, but that's one of the ways I would answer.
Certainly. Thank you for that, David. I think you're correct. There is a sort of structural, strategy there where, it sort of keeps the story moving as it bounces kind of from one dimension to the other. There's an interesting moment in the film, though, that I think might give us a clue, which is, recall, if you will, during the section where Stevens, in the sort of later time frame, is on his road trip to Clevedon to see Miss Kenton. He runs out of gas, and he winds up getting a lift from a fella who talks to him about Lord Darlington. And the fella says to him, essentially he says, what did you think of his politics? What did you think about Lord Darlington? They've discussed it. We come to understand that Lord Darlington is widely seen as a traitor and a fascist sympathizer and enabler. And Stevens says, more or less, it wasn't my job to agree or disagree. I was there to serve him. And then he says something about Lord Darlington, regretting the choices that he'd made. And the other fellow says to him, if a mistake was to be made, wouldn't you rather make your own? And Stephen says, he says something to the effect of, I'm on my way to try to correct my mistake now. Referring, of course, to his trip to see Miss Kenton. So I wonder if there is something in common about the way that Stevens conducts himself in his relationship with Miss Kenton and other people, and also the way that he or others conduct themselves in the context of the march of events, you know, this drive towards war and this, the sort of fascist enabling, activities of his employer.
I
Another
would
question.
say
Oh,
I would
please.
say something, Carol.
Please.
He thinks he's not allowed to give an opinion, but we don't know if he really has one. I mean, he doesn't ever, she says, why don't you express your feelings? And he really can't or doesn't or won't. And I think it's his training from his father, because he couldn't really feel, we don't see him feeling what we would feel too when the father dies. He sort of goes off to another task. So I think either he hasn't been allowed to have feelings, or he feels that his devotion is to just be neutral. And I never figured it out yet, which it is. And even with Miss, at the end, he still can't quite do it. So that's the tension for me. Is I just wanted him to say something throughout the movie, something. But maybe the role was that you can't. A butler maybe cannot do that.
Well, thank you for raising that, Carol. I think you're onto it. Right. We certainly see that Stevens is unable in some way, maybe even pathologically, to express himself, and we have some context about, his familial life, at least from his relationship with his father. We also see that he's sort of accepted this role for himself, which, at least in his mind, sort of disqualifies him from being able to take a stance or have agency. In fact, I want to read I have a quote that I want to read to you. This is from the author of the novel, Kazuo Ishiguro. And he says, quote, "Most of us don't run countries. We fit in somewhere if we're lucky. We learn to do our little job, and we try to do our little job to the best of our ability. And usually we offer up our contribution to somebody upstairs, a company, an employer, or a cause, or a country. We hope that contribution is going to be used well, but we often can't be sure. In that sense, I thought we're all rather like butlers." The thing I should say, though, and I'm interested to hear your perspectives on this, is whether you think that flies, or whether that's an unacceptable position to have. And so the kind of follow-up questions that I would wing to you, one would be, are there places where Stevens's position, this sort of position of neutrality actually does harm? Can we think of examples of that? I think there's one big one. And I guess another question I want to ask is a little simpler, which is, did you find him a sympathetic character? I see a hand from Kathleen. I want to give others a chance to speak to, so I'm going to call on Kathleen in just a moment, but if you do have a question or a comment about this or anything else, please do use that raise hand function and we'll get over to you. In the meantime, Kathleen, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the character of Stevens and how he couldn't communicate in any way that engendered warm feelings between another human being. He didn't seem to be able to give compliments or to talk about his feelings, that sort of thing. He actually, in the book, there's a scene towards the end where he looks at a group of people on the pier where they're waiting for the bus, and he sees them talking with each other and, having fun together. And he realizes that it's just a group of people who wanted to watch those lights come on. And they knew how to banter. And I don't think they used this in the film, but in the book, they used it a lot, the idea of bantering and how Stevens had no clue as to what that would entail. But he felt that maybe as he moved into the remains of his day, he should put some effort into learning how to banter. And so that there was a little bit of hope there for him, but overall, I didn't feel that hopeful for him as living out the rest of his life. I think, I don't know that he actually could make such a change.
Yes, it is sort of difficult to think that Stevens is going to, I don't know, be able to have this transformation of character. On one hand, we see that, the times are changing. I mean, he is in this sort of different world, and there's a new employer in the house. In fact, somebody who has a ping pong table in the place of the grand banquet table. So that maybe speaks to the difference of sensibilities. But he's ultimately not able to say what needs to be said to Miss Kenton at the end. He's not able to deliver, at least in the way that it seems like he needs to. And we end with a bird flying out the window and Stevens standing in the window behind bars, crestfallenly holding a ping pong paddle, stuck inside, which I think says a little bit about him as well. I'm going to go now to Jean. I see a hand up from Jean. And by the way, Jean, I love your image. So please go ahead and unmute yourself, Jean.
Oops, sorry about that. He was one of my favorite characters. He was such a powerful performer and so subtle too, in so many moments. You asked if I had sympathy, or we had sympathy for Stevens, and I definitely did, because it was so apparent that he knew nothing else. And especially when you know that his father was a butler, and that's all he seemed to know from a young age. And he lives in such an isolated world where he doesn't get a lot of exposure to anything else. And unlike, I've seen lots of films with butlers and service, service staff, but this, more than any of the others, made me think about, in such a powerful way, just how someone like him and other people like him can come to terms or be comfortable with that class system and have not only a real pride in, they have a real pride in their work and their job, but it's all rooted in a subservience. And so there's that, there's that dynamic to it that makes it so fascinating to me. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I think this is one of the big, themes of the film, right? Stevens has totally wedded himself to this idea of hierarchy, basically, this sort of intense, kind of innate hierarchy. He says something like, I think I wrote it down, a great gentleman must be possessed with dignity in keeping with his position. And there's this sort of preoccupation with position. This is, of course, something that is kind of baked into the British class system, the one that we see, very prominently with the kind of upstairs, downstairs, ultra rich, probably landed gentry of Lord Darlington's class, and of the servants, who work for him, who, have very bleak prospects outside of his employ. And we see times changing too, in the during Stephen's sort of later road trip to Clevedon, he stops in the bar and he hears people talking about how every man has a right to vote, and how this is what we fought the Germans for, and all this. So, I mean, we see this sort of tension between the kind of erosion of this old way of this hierarchy system where Stevens is very comfortable, and the sort of introduction of this new way of being. But I kind of want to zoom in. I want to go from here and zoom in on Stevens a little bit too, because to me, in certain ways, it seems like he's taking his, he's not the only service person, here, but he takes this sort of notion of dignity, is what he calls it, the sense of knowing your place and serving your role, and being dedicated to that and unshaking at that. He takes this to a level that other service people don't seem to. And even I wonder if it exceeds what his employers expect of him. I'm sort of stuck. This is, I won't digress too much, but I find it so funny that Lord Darlington sort of dispatches Stevens to basically give the birds and the bees talk to to Hugh Grant, who clearly knows about the birds and the bees.
That's hysterical.
Yeah. If you watch Merchant of Ivory movies, the joke about stuffy British people trying to talk about sex is like something that gives them no end of amusement. But beyond just the humor aspect of it, it's like Lord Darlington asks Stevens that because it would seem he has the assumption that Stevens has a sex life, a personal life, some experience. He has some part of himself that is not, the butler, that, that is not consumed by his butlering. But Stevens is totally absorbed in that. So, I mean, I wonder if I wonder what role the dignity, this sort of intense and even like kind of overcommitment, this overperformance of dignity, dignity as they put it in hierarchy, like what that does for Stevens or why he's so committed to it. I mean, is there something that he's hiding from with it?
I don't know if I can answer that question immediately, but you did make me think of a related thought or idea, that back to feeling some of the sympathy for him, and one of the few times you kind of see beyond his professional facade is that since he can't show his love and affection to his father directly, I just realized you do see it in the way that he's protective of his father's position there. He picks up after him, and he even then won't follow Emma Thompson into the room to see another mistake he's made because he doesn't want to admit to it, and he wants to kind of, he doesn't want to have to admit to his father's failings there. So that's another area that just made me see some of his heart below the surface.
Yes, I love the relationship between Stevens and his father. I think it's fascinating, if clearly troubled. And one thing that I would be interested to hear others take on is this sort of essentially a deathbed exchange. On his deathbed, the elder Stevens is able to speak frankly to the younger Stevens. He says, "I fell out of love with your mother. I loved her once, but the love went out of me when I found her carrying on." And then he says, "You've been a good son. I'm proud of you." How does this fit in the movie? I mean, or what did you make of that?
I just felt as though that the only time he's ever able to speak that way is when he knows that his time is so limited, and if there's shame in what he says or if he embarrasses himself, it doesn't matter because this is his last chance to do it, and he just put all his cards on the table.
Right. I think that's astute. And I also wonder if the elder Stevens is warning the younger Stevens in a way, you know.
Opening the door for him a little bit.
Right. One way to interpret that is, where the love going out of him is, he refers to his wife carrying on. And perhaps it's that he was hurt and he retreated from his vulnerability by, going into this, letting his human part drain out and the sort of functional part overwhelm. Or perhaps it's the case that his sort of ironclad dignity, as it were, is part of what led to that relationship to dissolve. So, I mean, I do think you're right. I mean, I think the idea of him sort of trying to open the door for his son a little bit is an interesting way to think about it. We're going to go now to Janice Bostman. Janice, would love to hear from you. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. So as much as you've just said that he had this unique relationship with his father, certainly not like any father, like most father-son relationships that we see in our world. What distressed me was the scene where Emma Thompson was weeping so violently, and he could barely show any empathy for her. And she was presumably the love of his life, but he, of course, never expressed it. And she wasn't just, crying some tears. She was on the floor hysterical. And, this man had no way to comfort her, let alone reassure her that everything would be okay. And instead tells her about some dust in the room that the parlor maid missed. I just hated him for that, to be honest. And you might have some other interpretation. The other thing I wanted to talk about was when he was driving the Daimler to go see her in the I guess that was the
West.
50s by then, or whenever the time was.
Mhm.
I mean, he was dishonest to all of those people in the pub. He let them believe that he was, in fact, a gentleman, but he finally owned up to the truth to the guy that brought him out to put the gas in the car the next day. And I think those were the most words that he strung together when he confessed that he was actually the butler there. I mean, he didn't have very long sentences in this. And I think that was the only honest thing that he really said. And like I said, the most words he uttered. And I was wondering why you thought he finally did it. Maybe because he knew he would never see this person again, that he was indebted to him. And then my third question had to do with the casting and wondering if you knew who else might have been considered for any of these roles, because it certainly was an all-star cast. So thank you very much for the choice and the introduction, which we did listen to beforehand. Thanks, Jacob.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry I dropped the question about the cast earlier. Let me speak to that first. I'm not sure about other actors who are considered for the roles, but I believe that just about all of the principals in this film were sort of regulars in the Merchant Ivory stable. I believe it was the film previous to this one, made by Merchant Ivory, was Howard's End, which is also superb. That also starred Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins and James Ivory and Ismail Merchant, and the third member of their coterie, Ruth Pryor Jabala, brought them back. And the Merchant Ivory Company, began making films in the 1960s, and they have different phases of their career, but they very much had like a sort of repertory company kind of feel to them. There were actors they used again and again. Hugh Grant is another one. Hugh Grant had been in Maurice, among various other Merchant Ivory productions. Christopher Reeve, also somebody they used many times. He was in the Bostonians as well. So these were, this was a creative team that had worked together. They had worked together a lot. And one thing I do know is that although the film is quite opulent, it's not a crazily high budget. It was not like a crazily high budgeted film. In fact, I believe that the actors mostly took below what they would have usually been paid to be in the film because, they expected it to be a prestige picture. And of course, it was rather successful and rather acclaimed. I like this question that you brought up about why Stevens lies while he's out on the road. It's an interesting one. And I think a question that is worth tying into it is, why is he going to see Miss Kenton? So, the way that I take it, at least, and I'm interested to hear the thoughts of others, the way that I am inclined to take it is, Stevens is somebody has totally devoted his life to being a sort of functionary in this particular context, within this sort of social hierarchy of this certain period of Britain in the home of Lord Darlington. And we begin with that being dismantled. We learned that it's planned that the hall is to be demolished and the rubble sold for £5,000. I mean, that's what's going to, remain of it. Although it's rescued in the end, and we see it sort of starting to come back to life, but sort of stripped down to bare walls. And so, by its new owner. So, I mean, I think we come upon Stevens in this time frame in a period of a kind of identity crisis. This question of who am I now? Now that the person I was doesn't make sense anymore. That context isn't there. What do I do now when my function, which has defined me, has ceased to be? And I think I see in Stevens almost this kind of bafflement about what happened because, he did everything he was supposed to do in his role, but things turned out bad, So, I mean, I think we find him in this place, not just of questioning who he is now and what he's to do, but also it's maybe a place where he's questioning his worldview, as much as he does anything else. And I think it's significant that this happens on the road, outside of, the confines of Darlington Hall. And we see him encounter these different kinds of people. We hear different accents. He's in a different region. We see him sleep in the room of a boy who's been killed in the war, which brings him face to face with the sort of stakes of this political, political scenario in a way that he never encountered in Darlington Hall, that he wouldn't have, where he was sort of insulated from it, not here. And so I wonder if Stevens is kind of trying on sort of different identities. If you recall, at the first place he stops, it's a briefer stop, he denies knowing Lord Darlington at all. He tries to sort of write himself out of that history, to write a past for himself where that's not part of his story. Then he kind of, writes this version of it, or tells this version of it where he was the politician, he was, the aristocrat. And, and finally he sort of speaks honestly. It's interesting because he doesn't tell the guy the truth at first. He really only begins to sort of spill and to confess perhaps, or to open up perhaps, once the discussion of Lord Darlington as a sort of, in this negative light comes up. And I wonder if he kind of, reverts a little bit, or he's, unable to, to pull himself out of that role, that position, hearing his former employer talked about like that. And I think there's a sort of human empathy he feels for his employer too, who's disgraced, which is difficult. I'd like to ask a question to the group, which is, what do you think Stephen's motivations are in going out to Clevedon to see Miss Kenton? I mean, what do you think he's hoping is going to happen? Do you think he intends to declare his love? Do you think he entertains that idea?
Yeah, I think I said earlier that I thought, not having read the book and maybe being a romantic, that was where he was headed, especially when he had said ahead of time that, he was going to fix some of the things from his past. Well, telling her that he wants her to come back to run the household again doesn't really fix the things from his past in any way that at least I, as the observer, would think. So I guess it's confusing, and yet at the same time, he is so into and only understanding the role of the butler, having learned it from his father, having basically had no other part of his life, that, you almost say, not only is it not my place to have an opinion, where he makes that remark many times, but he may have been so ingrained by the thought process that he's no longer able to truly have an opinion, even though we really glean from some of the other conversations that he does not agree with the view on Hitler, and he understands why his former employer was, by some, considered a traitor. Yet he's unable to put these things into any type of words. It's so against the personality that's been drummed into him, where he's allowed it to be drummed in, because it allows his escape from having to deal with people.
Right. I think you really, in that sort of last, sentence, you said this sort of escape from having to deal with people is very well observed. I mean, I think that's sort of at the heart of the matter. There is a sense, I think, where Stephen's, certainly he has been trained a certain way, and he's a product of his family life and his cultural, upbringing and, the values therein. But there's also a kind of cowardice there, There's a way where the sort of dignity, the dignity in the way he uses it, his decorum, his demeanor, his formality, his functionary role, it seems like this sort of excuses him, or shields him, is maybe a better word, from what? From human vulnerability, from being hurt by that, from having to be vulnerable to other people and expressing his feelings, from having to undergo inner moral conflict, of having to make a decision, of having agency, of having responsibility. It seems like Stevens has absented himself from that, and that's really disappointing. It's not the role that we want to see somebody take. We see him, maintain that position of neutrality. I think the place where it's probably the most harmful is with the Jewish girls who Lord Darlington orders dismissed. We don't know what happens to them, and that could be a very, bad story. That's a place where Stevens causes real harm, So you asked a while back about the weeping scene, and it's funny because we see these moments where Stevens is kind of we can see him sort of trying to do something, trying to reach out, but he just like doesn't have the right language or the vocabulary to do it. I mean, I think we understand. I think even Miss Kenton understands that when he says, there's a corner of the room that hasn't been dusted. What he's really trying to say in some sort of way is, don't go, or at least I see you, but it's hard to, it's from Miss Kenton's perspective, I would imagine it's hard to imagine a future, or not feel deeply hurt by somebody who can't say don't go and can only say there's dust in the drawing room. I wonder if why he's going to see Miss Kenton at the end is to I don't know what, bring back the good old days, do it again, but have it work out the right way, to go back to the past in a kind of way with this new sort of retrofitted, version of those good old days where things don't turn out bad, but again, that's not what happens, because that's not how life works, that's not what's needed for him at the moment. I mean, I think what's needed for him there, I think is clear, which is to express himself, to do what he couldn't do in that weeping scene. And he's not able to do it. He speaks to her tenderly for him, and he wishes her a good life. And he asks her to have a good life. But, but that's all we get, And I wonder if Miss Kenton understands that this is what he's trying to say. But again, I mean, that's not what's called for in the situation. Do we have any other thoughts or comments before we call it a night, my friends? I see one from Carol Klein. Carol, I think you're the last one. So let's please unmute yourself and we'll share that.
I guess, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I viewed it a little differently. I thought Anthony Hopkins was such a wonderful actor that he knew exactly what was going on all the time. He showed with his eyes, and his eyes filled with tears. I felt he understood it, that caste and class and habit were keeping him from saying things that he thought. And when Miss Kenton said that she's going to have a grandchild, he gave up on his desire to have her come back and work for him and renew their relationship, or make a relationship.
Right.
But I thought the acting was fascinating. And if you asked me at the conclusion, I would have said he loved her deeply. He understood all the politics and really did know what was going on, but was a prisoner of his society. And I am, as an aside, very anxiously awaiting Ishikuro's the movie of Clara and the Sun that he wrote 30 years later, and is fascinating.
well, thanks, Carol. That's an interesting perspective, and it's something I didn't think about. How does this, revelation of, her grandchild and sort of encountering her life there affect him? That's something I'm going to have to think about. Thanks for mentioning Clara too. Ishiguro has written a new book. In fact, he was on Fresh Air just this past week talking about it. So that is out there. I do see one more hand, so I'm going to call on Steve before we call it a night. And Steve, you'll be our last comment of the evening.
Hi, Jacob. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to to see this, and I saw a review, and I thought I would just read 2 lines from it if I could, because it really kind of hit home. I saw this film when I was much younger, 30 years younger, and I found it unbearably boring. Now that I've had some experience of life, like most of us had, I guess, I can relate to it and appreciate the nuance, subtleties of the wonderful performance given by Thompson and Hopkins, and the master played by the brilliant Mr. Fox. Yeah, I think that the older you get, the more you reflect on things in your life, and it really hit home in a couple of places. So I really appreciate the opportunity to watch something like this, and in the comfort of my home, I guess. So thanks again, Jacob. And as usual, another great choice of a movie that really leaves a very deep impression. Thanks.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Steve, and thanks for the kind words. I'm glad that you enjoyed the movie. I hope all of you got something out of it. We are at the end of our time here, so I think we will call it a night. Once again, very glad that you chose to spend a little bit of your evening with us. Hope I can tell you that we have many more film education courses coming up. As you can see here on the screen, we have several seminars in the future, as well as a new session of our long-running film history discussion series. I'll note that those seminars can be attended both on-site and remotely if you wish. We also have a whole bunch of other educational offerings coming up that we haven't announced yet, so please do keep your eye on our website and on our emails to learn more about that. Let me say too that this summer we're offering our summer filmmaking workshop for high school students once again. So if you are in high school, or you're the parent or a grandparent of a high schooler who's interested in filmmaking, please do check out our website to learn more. Bryn Mawr Film Institute is open for business, and as always, we are offering a robust lineup of new releases, not to mention repertory and other special programs. I'll give you a little sneak peek of what's coming up. This Friday, we're going to be opening the new documentary about the Venezuelan conductor Gustavo Dudamel. That's called Viva Maestro. And along with that, this Friday, we're going to be opening a very different 90s classic, which is Pulp Fiction. And we are also going to be announcing some sneak peek shows for a couple films that will open regularly the following week, those being The Northman and The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. So if you are a Viking buff or a Nicolas Cage buff or both, you are in luck. Anyway, please visit us on the web at brynmarfilm.org to see what we've got going on, and come see us at the movies. Finally, let me say that if you like tonight's discussion or anything else that we're doing, we always appreciate your support. This helps us present free programs like this, as well as all the other things we do at BMFI. And those are not entirely supported by ticket sales or course tuition, so support matters. We always appreciate donations, but I'll also say that one of the best ways to support us is by becoming a member, which comes with a whole heap of benefits. And I think that brings me to the end of my plugs. So thanks again. Hope you guys have a great night, and looking forward to seeing you next time around.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Good to see you again.
Farewell, folks. So long.